Have you ever watched someone make a decision that made absolutely no sense? Maybe they stayed in a relationship everyone knew was unhealthy. Maybe they cheated on a spouse despite having a family that they loved. Maybe they gambled away their savings. Maybe they committed a crime that was almost guaranteed to get them caught. And you found yourself asking, what were they thinking? The strange thing is, they probably were thinking. Not in a way that we imagine, because our brains aren't designed to see reality perfectly. They're designed to help us survive. Sometimes that means they're incredibly efficient, and sometimes it means they're incredibly wrong. Welcome back to The Human Pattern. I'm Liv. Last episode, I shared why this podcast exists and why understanding psychology has become such a huge part of my life. Today, I wanted to introduce something that completely changed the way I see people, including myself. Because if we're going to spend future episodes talking about crime, relationships, addiction, habits, success, failure, leadership, and everything in between, we first need to understand one thing. Your brain is not a perfectly objective machine, and neither is mine. Every single one of us walks through life believing that we're seeing reality clearly. But the truth is, we're seeing reality through filters, thousands of them, most of which we're completely unaware of. Think about how many decisions that your brain makes every single day: when to wake up, how to drive to work, whether someone looks trustworthy, what to eat, how to interpret a text message, whether someone was rude or just having a bad day. If your brain carefully analyzed every single decision from scratch, you'd be mentally exhausted before breakfast. So instead, your brain creates these shortcuts. Psychologists call many of these shortcuts cognitive biases. The word bias itself sounds negative, but biases aren't always bad. In fact, without them, we'd have trouble functioning. The problem is that shortcuts work wonderfully until they don't. And that's where our decision making starts getting very interesting. A cognitive bias is simply a predictable error in thinking, not because you're unintelligent, not because you're careless, but because you're human. That's something I really want this podcast to emphasize. When we study psychology, we're not studying broken people. We're studying normal human minds doing normal human things, including our own. One of my favorite examples is hindsight bias. It's the feeling that you get after something happens when you think, I knew that was going to happen, except most of the time you didn't. Your brain quietly rewires history to make the outcome seem obvious. Why? Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. So your brain prefers a story that feels neat and predictable, even if that story isn't completely accurate. Another bias that we'll come back to again and again is overconfidence. Most people believe that they're above average drivers, right? Above average communicators, above average decision makers. Statistically, that can't be true. Our brains naturally assume we're less vulnerable than other people. That's one reason scams continue to work. It's why people text while they're driving. It's why investors convince themselves they're different from everyone else. It's why people commit crimes believing they won't be caught. They're not always acting recklessly. They're often acting confidently. And confidence can be incredibly deceptive. Now let's talk about one of my favorite psychological concepts: cognitive dissonance. This is what happens when two things are true at the same time. I care about my health. I smoke. I value honesty. I lied. I know this relationship is unhealthy. I don't want to leave. Those contradictions create psychological discomfort. and our brain hates discomfort. So instead of changing our behavior, we often change our explanation. I'll quit next month. It's not that bad. They'll change. Everyone does it. I'm just under a lot of stress. Those explanations aren't always conscious lies. Many times we genuinely believe them. And that's what makes cognitive dissonance so fascinating. Our brains are trying to reduce emotional discomfort, not necessarily discover objective truth. This leads us to rationalization. If cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortable feeling, rationalization is the story that we tell ourselves to make that feeling disappear. Think about how often we say things like, deserved it. I'll start Monday. This is different. I had no choice. Sometimes those explanations are true. Sometimes they're simply the most comfortable story available. One thing I've learned is that human beings are incredible storytellers, not just to other people, but to ourselves. We're constantly building narratives that help us feel consistent, competent, and in control, even when reality is much messier. So you might be wondering, so what? Why does any of this matter? Because these same patterns show up everywhere. They're in courtroom testimony, they're in politics, they're in business, marriages, parenting, they're in addiction, social media, they're in your career, they're in your friendships, and they're in your own internal dialogue. Psychology isn't something that happens to other people. It's happening to all of us every day, every conversation, every decision. And once I started recognizing these patterns, I became much less interested in judging people and much more interested in understanding them. That doesn't mean that we excuse harmful behavior. Actions still have consequences, and people are still responsible for the choices that they make. But understanding why people make those choices helps us ask better questions. And better questions often lead to better answers. So, before our next episode, I want you to try something. Don't judge yourself and don't judge anyone else. Just observe. Pay attention to the stories that people tell. Now, notice how often someone says, I had no choice. I knew that would happen. I'm different. They deserved it. Pay attention to the stories that you tell yourself too. When something doesn't go your way, what's the first explanation your brain reaches for? Is it accurate or is it simply comforting? You might be surprised by what you notice. The more I study psychology, the less convinced I become that people are simply good or bad. Instead, I think we're all navigating the same incredibly complicated brain. And sometimes we navigate it well, sometimes we don't. That's exactly what we're going to keep exploring together. Next time, we're diving into one of my favorite questions. How much of who you are today was shaped before you were old enough to understand it? We'll explore childhood, attachment, early experiences, and why two people can live through similar events yet become completely different adults. Until then, stay curious. I'm Liv, and this has been The Human Pattern. I'll see you next time.